Tonight, you will disappear, not permanently, not painfully, but you will, at some point in the next few hours, cease to exist in the way you think of yourself now. The room around you will vanish. The thoughts rolling through your mind will dissolve, and in their place, in the quiet dark behind your closed eyes, something else will begin. Something strange and ancient and still not fully understood. You will dream. Every night, across the length and breadth of this planet, billions of human beings do the same extraordinary thing. They lie down, they grow still, they close their eyes, and then, willingly, almost ritually, they let go of the world. We call it sleep, but that word, so ordinary, so unremarkable, barely begins to describe what is actually happening. Because sleep is not an absence, it is not a pause. It is not the brain switching off like a light at the end of the day. Sleep is a transformation, a deep, orchestrated, biologically essential state in which the brain does some of its most important work, quietly, invisibly, beyond the reach of your waking awareness. But why? What is the brain actually doing during those hours of apparent inactivity? One of the most important discoveries in recent sleep science came from a team at the University of Rochester, led by neuroscientist Maken Nedergaard. In 2013, they published findings that revealed something remarkable about the brain during sleep. The brain, it turns out, has its own waste disposal system, a network of channels surrounding its blood vessels, which researchers named the glymphatic system, after the glial cells that form its walls. During waking hours, this system is largely inactive, but during sleep, it switches on. The channels widen. Cerebrospinal fluid floods through the brain's tissue, and in doing so, it flushes out the metabolic byproducts that have accumulated throughout the day, including amyloid beta, a protein whose buildup has been strongly linked to Alzheimer's disease. In other words, the sleeping brain is cleaning itself every night, automatically, as a core biological function. This discovery changed the way neuroscientists think about sleep. It was no longer enough to say that sleep was for rest. Sleep was for maintenance, for repair, for the kind of deep molecular housekeeping that cannot happen while the brain is busy processing the waking world. But cleaning is only one of sleep's many functions. Memory consolidation is another, and perhaps the one most directly connected to the experience of dreaming. During the waking day, your brain is constantly taking in information. Conversations, faces, facts, emotions, sequences of movement. A continuous flood of experience that arrives faster than the brain can fully process in real time. Think of the sleeping brain as doing the filing. The raw and unprocessed experiences of the day are gradually transferred from temporary storage, centered in a seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus, tucked deep in the temporal lobe, to longer-term storage distributed across the cortex. This process, called memory consolidation, happens primarily during sleep. Interrupt the sleep, and the memories are lost. This is why studying before sleeping is more effective than studying and staying awake. This is why a good night's sleep before an important exam matters. This is why children and teenagers, whose brains are in an especially intensive period of learning and development, need so much more sleep than adults. The learning does not end when school does. It continues, quietly, in the dark. Sleep also regulates emotion. The amygdala, the almond-shaped cluster of nuclei at the brain's emotional core, responsible for processing fear and threat and intense feeling, is kept in check during waking hours by the prefrontal cortex, which moderates and contextualizes its responses. But sleep-deprived people show a significantly increased amygdala reactivity. Their emotional responses become louder, less regulated, more impulsive. They cry more easily. They feel more threatened. They find it harder to think clearly under pressure. A sleepless night, it turns out, makes the world feel genuinely more overwhelming. Not because the world has changed, because the brain has lost its capacity to process it. And then there are the immune system, the cardiovascular system, the hormonal system, all profoundly affected by the quality and duration of sleep. Growth hormone is released primarily during deep sleep. The immune system performs a significant portion of its surveillance and repair during the night. Blood pressure drops during normal sleep, giving the heart its most important period of rest. Chronic sleep deprivation has been linked to increased risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, depression, and dementia. Sleep, in short, is not one thing. It is many things happening simultaneously. It is a complex, a precisely choreographed biological performance, and the brain is both the conductor and the orchestra. Which brings us to the architecture of that performance, because sleep is not a single, uniform state. It is a journey through distinct territories, each with its own biology, its own purpose, and its own relationship to the strange phenomenon of dreaming. To understand dreams, we have to begin with sleep itself. And to understand sleep, we have to begin with a question that sounds deceptively simple. What is it for? You might assume the answer is obvious. Sleep is for rest, for recovery, for allowing a tired body and a busy mind to reset before the next day begins. And there is truth in that, but it is only the beginning of the truth. Consider what happens when sleep is taken away. In the 1960s, a 17-year-old student named Randy Gardner stayed awake for 11 consecutive days as part of a science fair experiment. By day 4, he was hallucinating. By day 6, he had lost the ability to complete simple sentences. By day 10, his short-term memory had essentially collapsed. He recovered after sleeping, but the experiment demonstrated in vivid human terms, on what animal studies had been suggesting for years, that sleep is not a luxury, it is a biological necessity. Deprive a rat of sleep entirely and it will die in 2 to 3 weeks. Deprive a human being of sleep for long enough, and the consequences are similarly catastrophic. If you were to watch someone sleep, watching not just their body but the electrical activity of their brain recorded through electrodes placed gently on the scalp, you would see something that looks less like stillness and more like music. A rhythm of rising and falling waves, patterns shifting and deepening and lightening over the course of the night, cycling with a loose regularity, repeating with subtle variations, building towards something that breaks open in the final hours before waking. This is the sleep cycle, and understanding it is the key to understanding dreams. In the 1950s, a graduate student named Eugene Aserinsky was working in the laboratory of sleep researcher Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago. One night, while monitoring a sleeping child, Aserinsky noticed something strange on the recording machine. During a particular phase of sleep, the child's eyes were moving rapidly back and forth beneath the closed lids. in a pattern quite unlike anything observed during other sleep stages. When Aserinsky and Kleitman woke subjects during this phase, they reported rich, vivid, detailed dreams the vast majority of the time. They had discovered REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and with it, the first solid scientific bridge between brain activity and the experience of dreaming. But REM sleep is not where the night begins. To get there, the brain first passes through a series of stages that researchers call non-REM sleep, or NREM, which itself divides into several distinct phases of increasing depth. The first stage of NREM sleep is the threshold, the hypnagogic state, the moment of transition between waking and sleeping that most people experience as a kind of pleasant dissolution, a loosening of thought, a softening of sensation, the sense that the edges of consciousness are becoming pleasantly blurred. The brain shifts from the fast, small beta waves of alert, waking thought to the slower, larger alpha waves of relaxed wakefulness, and then into the even slower theta waves of light sleep. Muscle tone decreases, heart rate slows, body temperature drops slightly, and sometimes, in a brief, vivid flash, the brain produces what is called a hypnagogic jerk, a sudden sensation of falling, a twitch of the leg or arm, a fragment of image, a face, a place, a word that floats up from somewhere and disappears before it fully forms. This is stage 1. It lasts only a few minutes. It is barely sleep at all. You could be woken from it by a whisper. Stage 2 is more substantial. The brain now produces characteristic bursts of activity called sleep spindles, brief, rapid oscillations of neural firing that researchers believe play an important role in processing and consolidating the day's experiences. Scattered among these spindles are K-complexes, large, sharp waves that appear to suppress external arousal, protecting sleep from being broken by minor disturbances. Body temperature continues to drop. Breathing becomes more regular. The outside world recedes further, and then comes deep sleep. Stages 3 and 4, often grouped together now as slow wave sleep, or N3. The brain produces slow, synchronized waves of extraordinary amplitude, delta waves. They are the deepest electrical rhythm the sleeping brain generates, and they are associated with the most profound physical restoration, the release of growth hormone, the repair of tissue, the strengthening of immune function. This is the sleep that leaves you feeling genuinely rested. It is the sleep that children are most reluctant to be woken from, because they spend more time in it and their growing bodies need it most desperately. Interestingly, it is also the stage of sleep most associated with sleepwalking and night terrors, not with dreaming in the narrative sense, but with an incomplete arousal from deep sleep that sends the body moving, or the voice speaking, or the emotions flooding without the organizing framework of full consciousness. The person who sleepwalks is not acting out a dream. They are stuck between sleep's deepest darkness and waking, moving through a world they cannot process. After slow wave sleep, the brain begins its ascent. Heart rate rises slightly, the body becomes more active, and then, approximately 90 minutes after the night began, the first REM period arrives. This is where the world changes. In REM sleep, the brain's electrical activity shifts dramatically. The slow, rolling waves of deep sleep give way to a fast, irregular, yet almost chaotic pattern that looks, on the EEG recording, uncannily similar to the waking brain. If you saw only this pattern and did not know it came from a sleeping subject, you might assume the person was awake, alert, engaged, and in a sense, they are. The brain during REM is firing on many of its most sophisticated circuits. The limbic system, the emotional brain, home of the amygdala and the hippocampus, is highly active. The visual cortex is generating images with startling vividness. The motor cortex is planning movements, and yet, crucially, the body cannot move. A mechanism in the brainstem sends signals that actively paralyze the major muscle groups. The body is held still. This is not a malfunction, it is a safeguard. Without this paralysis, you would physically enact your dreams. You would run from your dreamed monsters, punch your dreamed enemies, leap from your dreamed precipices. The paralysis protects you, and everyone sleeping near you. The first REM period of the night lasts only about 10 minutes. Then the cycle begins again. Light sleep, deep sleep, back to REM. But with each repetition, and there are typically 4 or 5 in a full night, the balance shifts. The early cycles are weighted toward deep, slow-wave sleep. The later cycles are weighted toward REM. By the final hours of a full night's sleep, REM periods may last 45 minutes or more. This is why dreams tend to be longest and most vivid in the early morning hours. This is why setting an alarm and cutting sleep short can feel so disorienting. You're often severing the night precisely at its richest dreaming time. The night, then, is not flat. It is a landscape, with valleys of deep, still restoration and peaks of vivid electric inner life. And at those peaks, the most mysterious work of the sleeping mind takes place. So what exactly is happening in the brain when you dream? Modern neuroimaging, particularly functional MRI and PET scanning, has allowed researchers to peer inside the dreaming brain with a clarity that Oserinsky and Kleitman could only have imagined. And what they have found is a picture of extraordinary selective activation. During REM sleep, certain brain regions become dramatically more active than in waking life. Others become quieter, and the pattern of those activations and deactivations maps with remarkable precision onto the content and character of the dream experience. The limbic system burns bright. The amygdala, always the brain's sentinel for threat and fear, is especially active during REM, more active in many studies than during normal waking. This is why emotions in dreams are so vivid, so urgent, so often tinged with anxiety or longing or grief. The emotional brain is running hot, and the moderating influence of the prefrontal cortex, the rational planning, reality-checking part of the brain behind your forehead, is comparatively suppressed. This suppression of the prefrontal cortex during dreaming is one of the most revealing facts in sleep neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex is where you check your assumptions, weigh probabilities, make logical decisions, and recognize implausibilities. It is the part of you that knows in waking life, that you cannot fly, that your long-dead grandmother cannot be sitting at the kitchen table, that the building you're walking through could not possibly have those rooms in that configuration. In a dream, the prefrontal cortex does not make these objections. It is largely offline, and so the dreaming mind accepts everything it is shown. The impossible is unremarkable. The dead are present. Time moves in any direction or none, and all of it feels from the inside utterly real. Meanwhile, the visual cortex is generating imagery from within. The eyes are closed, the retinas are sending no signal, but the visual areas of the occipital lobe are firing as if they were seeing. Not randomly, the imagery of dreams has a coherence, a narrative logic of its own, even if it defies the logic of waking life. Faces appear, places are rendered with architectural detail, colours are often vivid and saturated, movement flows. Where does this imagery come from? This is one of the genuinely open questions in dream science. The answer almost certainly involves memory, but not memory replayed straightforwardly, like a video recording. Dream imagery tends to be composite, a place that has the structure of your childhood home but the wallpaper from a hotel you visited once, a person with your friend's voice and a stranger's face. The brain during dreaming seems to be engaged in something more like creative recombination than faithful recall, mixing and merging fragments of experience into new configurations that have never existed in waking reality. This creative recombination may not be accidental. Some researchers, including Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the most prominent voices in contemporary sleep science, have proposed that REM sleep serves a specific function of emotional memory processing, not just storing memories, but reprocessing them, stripping away some of the emotional charge while preserving the informational content, allowing the brain to revisit difficult or emotionally intense experiences in a neurochemical environment that is different from waking, specifically lower in norepinephrine, the stress neurotransmitter, which may make that revisitation less painful and more flexible. Walker has described REM sleep as a form of overnight therapy, a nightly session in which the mind returns to the wounds of the day and of the past, and carefully, without the full sting of the original experience, tries to make sense of them. This is a compelling idea. It is supported by evidence that people who sleep well after traumatic or emotionally distressing experiences show better emotional recovery than those who do not. It is supported by the observation that the amygdala, the emotional center, shows reduced activation to previously distressing stimuli after a night of normal sleep. It is also supported, intriguingly, by the fact that a class of antidepressants called SSRIs, which among other effects tend to suppress REM sleep, are associated in some patients with a worsening of certain emotional symptoms in the short term. But it is worth being careful here. Walker's work is influential, and his synthesis is powerful, but not all researchers agree that REM sleep is primarily a form of emotional therapy. Yes, some emphasize its role in procedural learning, the kind of unconscious skill-based memory that underlies riding a bicycle or playing a musical instrument. Others focus on its role in creative problem-solving. The truth, as is so often the case in neuroscience, is probably complex and multifaceted. REM sleep likely serves several functions simultaneously, not all of them fully understood. What is clear is that the dreaming brain is doing something functional, something purposeful at the level of biology, even if its moment-to-moment content, the stories, the symbols, the images, may not always carry neat, decodable meaning. And that brings us to the most ancient question of all, the one that has occupied shamans and analysts and neuroscientists in turn. Do dreams mean something? The honest answer is, we do not fully know. What we know is that the content of dreams is not random. It is shaped by your waking experiences, your memories, your fears, your desires, your unresolved conflicts. People who have experienced trauma tend to dream about it. This is one of the central features of post-traumatic stress disorder. in which the normal REM sleep processing of emotional memory seems to break down, and the traumatic experience returns night after night in its full, unattenuated emotional force. People who are learning a new skill often dream about practicing it. Studies have shown that subjects learning a maze navigation task, when allowed to sleep, reported dreaming of the maze and performed better on it the next day than those who slept but did not dream of it. The Tetris effect, in which people who play the game for many hours begin to see the falling blocks in hypnagogic imagery as they drift towards sleep, is a milder but well-documented version of the same phenomenon. Dreams are also shaped by the emotional concerns of waking life in subtler ways. A person going through a divorce may not dream directly of the divorce, but may dream persistently of losing things, of being lost, of houses that do not hold together. A person facing an important decision may dream of roads that fork, be of choices with no obvious right answer. This is not prophecy. It is the brain, turning its problems over in the night, examining them from angles the waking mind does not have time for. Whether this constitutes meaning, in the deep sense of a message that can be decoded and acted upon, is, as it has always been, a matter of perspective. What neuroscience gives us is not a cipher key for dream symbols, but something more interesting. A picture of a brain that is profoundly concerned with your emotional life, your memories, and your sense of self, even when you're not aware that it is working. Of all the experiences that sleep brings, none is more universal or more visceral than the nightmare. Everyone has had them. The sense of being chased and unable to run fast enough, the feeling of falling from a great height, the sudden terrible presence of something threatening in a dark room, the dream in which someone you love is in danger and you cannot reach them. These experiences are so common, so deeply shared across cultures and throughout history, that they suggest something fundamental about the dreaming brain's preoccupations. From a neuroscientific perspective, nightmares are closely linked to the overactivation of the amygdala during REM sleep. Remember that the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, is highly active during dreaming, and the prefrontal cortex, which normally regulates and contextualizes fear responses, is comparatively quiet. This creates a neurological landscape in which fear, once activated, can run without a handbrake. Nightmares are most common in childhood, peaking, many researchers believe, between the ages of 3 and 6, at precisely the developmental period when children are beginning to form more sophisticated models of danger and mortality, when they are old enough to understand that bad things can happen, but too young to have developed reliable emotional regulation. The dreaming brain, working over the child's emotional development through the night, sometimes generates more than it can process. The result is a nightmare, but nightmares are not only, or even primarily, a childhood phenomenon. They increase dramatically following trauma, grief, anxiety, and stress. They are one of the core diagnostic features of post-traumatic stress disorder, in which a specific subtype, the trauma replay nightmare, recreates the traumatic event with painful fidelity, night after night, in a way that appears to represent a failure of the normal emotional processing that REM sleep is supposed to provide. Why does this failure occur? One prominent theory, proposed by psychiatrist and dream researcher Ernest Hartman, suggests that dreams normally perform a kind of gentle, gradual approach to emotional material. processing feelings in metaphorical, slightly displaced form rather than directly replaying them. In normal dreaming, even the emotional residue of a difficult day may appear in displaced form. A dream of being criticized by a stranger, rather than a direct replay of the specific argument you had with your partner. This displacement seems to be protective. It allows processing without re-traumatization. In PTSD, this displacement mechanism appears to break down. The traumatic material returns undisguised. And because the amygdala's response to the trauma is as intense as the original experience, the body floods with stress hormones, the heart races, the breathing quickens. The dream does not heal. It wounds. One of the more compelling therapeutic developments in this area has been a technique called image rehearsal therapy, developed by researcher Barry Krakow. Patients are taught to take a recurring nightmare and, in waking life, rewrite its ending. They then rehearse the new version mentally while awake, repeatedly, until the new narrative begins to replace the old one in sleep. The results in clinical trials have been striking. A significant reduction in nightmare frequency and intensity, and improvements in overall sleep quality and daytime symptoms of PTSD. This is a remarkable finding. It suggests that the waking mind has more influence over the dreaming mind than we typically assume, that the narratives we carry consciously are not sealed off from the narratives our sleeping brain generates. That, with practice, we can, at least in some measure, reach into the dreaming brain and change its stories, which leads us naturally to one of the most fascinating phenomena in the entire landscape of sleep, the lucid dream, but we will come to that. First, a moment with fear itself. Why does the dreaming brain so often generate threatening scenarios? Why, given that dreaming is in so many ways a creative and pleasurable state, do so many of its productions carry the quality of danger? One influential theory comes from the Finnish philosopher and neuroscientist Antti Revonsuo, who proposed what he called the threat simulation theory of dreaming. Revonsuo argued that the evolutionary function of dreaming, at least in its ancestral form, was to simulate threatening situations and rehearse responses to them. In a world full of predators and violence and social conflict, a brain that could practice threat detection and response during sleep would have a survival advantage. The nightmare on this view is not a malfunction, it is a training exercise. Now, the theory has its critics. It is not easy to test evolutionary hypotheses, and the full diversity of dream content does not reduce neatly to threat simulation. But it captures something real about the character of many dreams. The persistent sense of being chased, the social threat of humiliation or rejection, the survival-level fears of falling, drowning, being trapped. These themes are too universal, too consistent across cultures and ages to be entirely coincidental. The dreaming brain seems drawn to scenarios of danger the way a tongue is drawn to a sore tooth, not from masochism, but from a deep biological compulsion to examine and prepare for what threatens. Imagine becoming aware, the middle of a dream, that you are dreaming, not waking up, not leaving the dream, but remaining fully inside it, with the vividness and sensory richness of the dream world intact, while simultaneously recognizing with complete clarity that none of it is real, that you are asleep, that the world around you is a creation of your own sleeping mind, and then imagine being able to act on that knowledge, to fly if you choose, to walk through walls, to summon people, to change the scene, to confront the thing that has been chasing you and ask it, face to face, what it wants. This is lucid dreaming, and it is real. The existence of lucid dreaming was long dismissed by mainstream science as either a confusion of waking imagination with sleep or a form of brief waking within what was called a false awakening. Then, in 1975, a psychologist named Keith Hearn at the University of Hull designed an elegant experiment to test the question definitively. He enlisted a skilled lucid dreamer named Alan Worsley and worked out a communication protocol. If Worsley became lucid during a dream, he would signal by moving his eyes in a predetermined pattern, left, right, detectable on the EEG recording. In the early morning of April 12, 1975, the signal appeared on the recording. While unmistakably in REM sleep, Worsley had become aware that he was dreaming and communicated that awareness to the waking world. The experiment was later independently replicated by Stephen LaBerge at Stanford University, who went on to establish the field of lucid dreaming research on a rigorous scientific footing. LaBerge developed training techniques, including a method called mild, mnemonic induction of lucid dreams, which involves waking briefly in the early morning hours and using intention setting before returning to sleep, that significantly increased lucid dreaming frequency in subjects who practiced them. What happens in the brain during a lucid dream is, in itself, a remarkable story. Neuroimaging studies, including work by Ursula Voss and colleagues using simultaneous EEG and other measurements, have found that lucid dreaming involves a partial reactivation of the prefrontal cortex. Remember that in ordinary dreaming, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of self-reflection, logical reasoning and awareness of one's own mental states, is comparatively inactive. This is why we do not question the dream while we are in it. But in lucid dreaming, activity in the frontal lobes increases. The dreamer gains something that the ordinary dreamer lacks: metacognitive awareness. Awareness of their own awareness. The ability to stand, in some sense, simultaneously inside the dream and outside it. This is, philosophically speaking, one of the more astonishing states in the entire spectrum of human consciousness. It is a state in which the brain simultaneously generates a completely convincing simulation of reality and recognizes it as a simulation. It is watching yourself dream while dreaming. It is the mind bending back to observe itself. Not everyone can lucid dream easily. Studies suggest that the ability is distributed across the population, with some individuals having spontaneous lucid dreams regularly throughout their lives, and others rarely or never experiencing them. There appear to be individual differences in what researchers call metacognitive ability, the capacity for self-reflection and mental self-monitoring, that correlate with lucid dreaming frequency. And there is preliminary evidence that people who score higher on measures of reflective awareness and certain aspects of mindfulness tend to lucid dream more readily. Lucid dreaming has attracted considerable interest not just as a curiosity, but as a potential therapeutic tool. Researchers have explored its application in treating recurring nightmares. If a person can become aware that they are in a nightmare and recognize it as a dream, they may be able to alter its course, or at least reduce its emotional impact. There is also interest in using lucid dreaming as a motor rehearsal technique for athletes and rehabilitation patients, since the brain during REM sleep may process imagined movement with some of the same neural machinery as actual movement. But we should be honest about the current state of this research. Much of it is preliminary. The clinical applications of lucid dreaming are still being studied, and the evidence base is not yet strong enough to make confident claims about its therapeutic value. What is clear is that the phenomenon is real, that its neural correlates are increasingly well understood, and that it represents one of the most vivid examples of the brain's extraordinary plasticity, its capacity to do things that should, by ordinary logic, be impossible, like being asleep and awake simultaneously, like dreaming with open eyes on a world you know is not there. There is another experience at the border of sleep and waking, less celebrated than lucid dreaming, and considerably more alarming. It happens when the brain's mechanisms of REM sleep fail to synchronize properly with the body's return to waking consciousness. When the mind emerges from the dream state or begins to enter it, but the muscular paralysis of REM sleep has not lifted. This is sleep paralysis. You are awake. You know you are awake. You can see your room, or some version of it, often subtly distorted as the residue of the dream state lingers in your perceptions. You can think, you can be afraid, but you cannot move. You cannot speak. You cannot call out. Your body is lying exactly where it fell asleep, held immovably still by the same mechanism that prevents you from acting out your dreams. Except now your conscious mind is present, and it is experiencing this paralysis not as the benign nothing that it is during ordinary sleep, but as a terrifying confinement. And often, this is the part that explains centuries of mythology, there is a presence. Something is in the room. Something heavy is sitting on your chest, making it harder to breathe. A dark figure stands in the corner, or sits at the foot of the bed, or crouches over you. Its features may be unclear, but its weight and its menace are unmistakable. You cannot move. You cannot scream. You can only lie there, knowing it is there, unable to escape. In every culture that has documented sleep paralysis, this intruder has been given a name and a mythology. In medieval Europe, it was the night hag, or the old hag, sometimes called the mare, from which we get the word nightmare. In Newfoundland, it is the old hag still. In Japan, it is kanashibari, the state of being bound by metal. In West Africa, it takes the form of a witch crouching on the chest. In Brazil, it is the pisadeira, a crone who sits on sleeping people. In Arabic tradition, it is a jinn. In the Caribbean, a sukuyon. Across every culture, across every era, the same experience, the same terrifying presence, the same sense of being held. What is actually happening is neurological. The brainstem mechanism that paralyzes the body during REM sleep, normally activated before dreaming begins and deactivated before waking, has come unsynchronized. The motor paralysis persists past the point where consciousness has returned. Simultaneously, the brain, still partially in the dream state, is generating hallucinations, visual and auditory and tactile, often intensely realistic, often with the specific emotional tone of threat that characterizes REM stage amygdala activity. The presence, the weight on the chest, the dark figure, these are hypnopompic hallucinations, hallucinations at the edge of waking. They are not imagined, they are not metaphorical. They are as vivid and as real seeming to the person experiencing them as any waking perception. But they arise from the dreaming brain, not from the room. Sleep paralysis affects perhaps 8% of the general population at least once in their lives. though studies vary widely on this estimate. It is more common in people with irregular sleep schedules, in people who are sleep deprived, and in people with narcolepsy, a neurological condition that disrupts the normal boundaries between waking and sleeping states. It is also more common when sleeping in a supine position on one's back, for reasons that are not entirely clear, though there is speculation that this position may affect breathing and oxygen levels in ways that facilitate the incomplete arousal. Most episodes are brief, lasting from a few seconds to a few minutes, rarely longer, and end on their own as the paralysis mechanism fully releases. But in those few minutes, and the experience can be so overwhelming that it leaves lasting fear. Many people who experience it repeatedly come to dread sleeping. Some develop insomnia as a secondary consequence of sleep paralysis, the fear of the experience itself disrupting the very process that would produce it. There is something philosophically vertiginous about sleep paralysis. It is a vivid demonstration that the brain can manufacture experiences of other beings, presences, entities, beings with weight and intention, out of nothing but its own activity. It is a reminder that consciousness, even fully waking consciousness, is built not from a direct feed of reality, but from the brain's best construction of reality based on available information. And when the available information includes the emotionally saturated, reality-defying activity of the dreaming REM brain, what the mind constructs can be terrifying. Sleep paralysis does not prove anything about the supernatural, but it does prove something about the mind. It proves that the mind is capable of creating beings so vivid and so real that they have haunted human culture across the entire length of recorded history. Whatever else the sleeping brain is doing, it is also, under the right circumstances, making monsters. We have travelled now through the architecture of sleep, through the neuroscience of dreaming, through the strange territories at the edge of consciousness. But before we close this journey, it is worth stepping back and considering the larger picture, the full scope of what sleep does for us and what we lose when it is taken away. Because in the modern world, sleep is in trouble. The industrialized world is collectively sleeping less than it has at almost any point in history. Artificial light has extended the waking day. Screen technology, with its blue light emission that suppresses melatonin production and delays the circadian signal to sleep, has invaded the bedroom. Work culture, in many societies, has constructed an implicit equation between sleeplessness and productivity. The person who sleeps less is seen as more driven, are more serious, more committed. Politicians and executives boast of how little they sleep. The sacrifice of sleep is treated as a virtue, and the consequences are becoming visible. We have already mentioned the emotional dysregulation that sleep deprivation produces, the amygdala hypersensitivity, the reduced prefrontal modulation, the emotional world that feels louder and harder to manage. But the mental health consequences extend further. There is a well-established bidirectional relationship between sleep disturbance and depression. Poor sleep makes depression worse, and depression makes sleep worse, in a cycle that can be extremely difficult to break. Insomnia, the inability to fall asleep, stay asleep, or achieve restorative sleep despite adequate opportunity, affects an estimated 10 to 15% of adults in the developed world chronically, with a much higher percentage experiencing it at some point in their lives. It is not a minor inconvenience, or it is associated with significantly elevated risk of depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, and reduced quality of life, and it is undertreated. Many people who struggle with it do not seek help, assuming there is nothing to be done. There is, in fact, a great deal to be done. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, known as CBTI, is now considered by many sleep researchers and clinicians to be the most effective first-line treatment for chronic insomnia, with long-lasting benefits that outperform medication in most head-to-head comparisons. It works by addressing the thoughts and behaviors that perpetuate insomnia, the anxiety about sleep, the clock watching, the extended time in bed that paradoxically reduces sleep drive, and replacing them with patterns that strengthen the brain's natural sleep mechanisms. Sleep is also connected to learning in ways that have profound implications for education. Students who are regularly sleep deprived show measurably worse academic performance, not because they are less intelligent, but because the consolidation of memory that should happen during sleep is disrupted. The information learned during the day is not being properly transferred into long-term storage. The calculation is heartbreaking in its simplicity. We ask children and teenagers, whose brains are in the most intensive period of learning they will ever experience, to begin school at times that are biologically incompatible with their developing sleep patterns. Adolescent brains, under the influence of puberty-related changes in circadian biology, naturally shift toward a later sleep and wake schedule. This is not laziness, it is neurobiology. A teenager whose brain tells them to fall asleep at 11 and wake at 8 is not malfunctioning. They are following their biology. When school starts at 7:30, they are being asked to learn in a state of significant sleep deprivation. The data on later school start times are consistent. Later start times are associated with better academic performance, better mental health, reduced rates of depression and anxiety, and fewer car accidents among teenage drivers. And then there is the relationship between sleep and aging. As we grow older, sleep architecture changes. Slow-wave sleep, the deepest, most physically restorative stage, decreases substantially. The ability to maintain continuous sleep diminishes. Many older adults find themselves waking more frequently, spending more time in lighter stages, achieving less of the deep sleep that the body and brain most need. This decline in sleep quality has been linked, in a number of longitudinal studies, to increased cognitive decline and higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. Whether poor sleep causes cognitive decline, or whether the early neurological changes of dementia disrupt sleep, or whether both are true simultaneously, this remains an active area of research. What is clear is that the relationship is real, and that the glymphatic system's ability to clear amyloid beta and other neurotoxic proteins during sleep may be one of the mechanisms that link sleep quality to brain health across the lifespan. We are also learning more about individual differences in sleep need and sleep timing. The popular belief that everyone needs exactly 8 hours of sleep is an approximation. Adults need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours, and individual variation is genuine. There is also strong genetic variation in what researchers call chronotype, the natural timing of an individual's sleep-wake cycle, ranging from extreme early birds who are genuinely alert at 5 in the morning and tired by 9 at night, to extreme night owls for whom the opposite is true. These chronotypes are not a matter of willpower or discipline. They are, to a substantial degree, determined by the genetics of the circadian clock. Understanding all of this, the biology, the necessity, the profound connections between sleep and every domain of health and human functioning, is not just academically interesting. It is a call to rethink how we treat sleep, not as an inconvenience to be minimized, not as a luxury to be earned, but as a biological necessity as fundamental as eating, as breathing, as the need for clean water. The sleeping brain is not wasting time. It is doing everything. We have come a long way tonight. From the first moments of falling asleep, that gentle dissolution, that soft letting go, through the rhythmic cycles of the night, the valleys of deep repair, and the peaks of vivid inner life. We have looked into the brain's own laboratories of memory and emotion. We have stood at the edge of consciousness in the strange borderlands of paralysis and lucidity. We have followed the science as far as it goes, and now, at the end, it is worth sitting with what the science does not yet know. Because after all of it, the neuroimaging, the EEG studies, the genetic analyses, the clinical trials, the decades of sleep laboratory work, the deepest question remains unanswered. Why do we experience anything at all? This is, in philosophy, the hard problem of consciousness. The question of how and why physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, to the felt quality of redness, or pain, or music, or love. It is hard enough as a question about waking consciousness. As a question about dreaming consciousness, it becomes harder still. Because in the dream, there is a subject. There is someone to whom the dream is happening. There is a dreamer, a self, an experiencing center, who sees the images, feels the emotions, moves through the dreamed world. And this dreamer is you, a version of you that exists only in your sleeping brain, assembled from memory and emotion and the quiet firing of neurons, with no external input beyond the biology of the sleeping body. Who is that dreamer? Where do they live? And where do they go when the dream ends? These are not questions that neuroscience has answered. They may be questions that neuroscience as currently constituted cannot answer, because they touch on the nature of consciousness itself, which remains, as the philosopher David Chalmers put it, genuinely mysterious. Not mysterious in the sense of waiting for better technology or cleverer experiments. Mysterious in a deeper sense. The sense that even a complete map of every neuron, every synapse, every chemical signal in the dreaming brain would not, by itself, tell you what it is like to be inside that dream. And yet the science has given us something extraordinary. It has given us a picture of sleep as one of the most essential, most precisely organized, most biologically consequential processes in the life of any animal that has ever evolved a brain. It has given us an understanding of how the sleeping brain repairs itself, how it consolidates what matters and releases what does not, how it processes the emotional freight of a life lived in a world that does not make promises. It has given us a window into the dreaming brain, electric, emotional, memory-drenched, fear-testing, creatively recombinant, and shown us that the inner life of the night is not passive, not meaningless, not wasted. It has shown us that the dreams you have tonight are not noise, they are signal. Not necessarily a code to be cracked, not necessarily a message from somewhere beyond the biological, but signal in the true sense. The brain speaking to itself, processing what hurts, rehearsing what matters, trying, night after night, in the only language it has when reason is asleep, to make you whole. Every night you disappear into the dark, and every night something extraordinary happens in that dark. Something your waking mind will never fully know about. Something that keeps you alive and sane and human. Something that has been happening since long before there were words for it. Since the first nervous systems began to cycle between activity and rest. Since the first brain complex enough to dream began dreaming, in whatever form those first dreams took, in whatever ancient night. The brain, asleep, is the brain at its most essentially itself, unguarded, honest, working. So tonight, when you feel the day begin to loosen its grip, when the thoughts start to blur and the sounds grow distant and the body grows heavy, do not resist it. Let go. The night knows what it is doing, and the dreams will come